Welcome into the ArtGibbs Sports Business Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. And in this episode, we're going to look at the TV contracts of the non-Power 5 FBS football teams. So these are going to be the conference TV contracts for the teams that are not in the Power 5. In the previous episode, we went over the Power 5, so we saw some of those numbers. Now we're going to look into the non-Power 5, and again, there is flux in this area as well as obviously there being flux in the Power 5. So without further ado, we're going to go through the non-Power 5 TV contracts, current ones, what we know, etc. So we'll start off with the AAC. That's the top dog. In 2019, they signed a 12-year deal with ESPN worth over $83 million a year, and goes through the 2031-2032 year. Each school, it's estimated, receives around $7 million annually, and they are well and away top dog in the non-Power 5. Of course, that would make sense. Cincinnati, Memphis, Houston, UCF are all in there. Now, of course, Houston, Cincinnati, UCF are leaving, but that makes sense that in 2019 they were top dog in football, and so hence they've signed a contract that puts them in that place. Next up is going to be the Conference USA. This is a team that this is a conference that in 2018 they signed a 5-year deal with CBS Sports Network. There's some other players involved on some of their other games, but the lion's share of their games are broadcast by the CBS Sports Network. And again, that deal was signed in 2018, and it's estimated that the teams get roughly $400,000 to $500,000 per year. Now, again, compared to the AAC at $7 million, that's much less. Now, Conference USA is not the highest in these non-Power 5, but of course, Conference USA is about to lose Marshall, Old Dominion, and Southern Miss. So again, we're in flux here as well. Next up, Mid-America Conference. They signed, in 2019, they signed a deal with CBS Sports, a 4-year extension to their current TV deal. That's going to run through 2022-2023. It's a 4-year extension from their original deal, and it's worth about $8 million a year total. So each school receives roughly $600,000. Next up, and this is actually the second highest, so behind the AAC, next up is the Mountain West, and again, that makes sense, Conference of Boise State, etc. They have a 6-year deal. They're currently on a 6-year deal that goes through 2025-2026 with CBS and Fox, where it's a $270 million deal, and roughly each school receives about $4 million annually. Now, that's a considerable increase from their previous deal, which was at $1.1 million per school per year on their previous deal. But again, this 6-year deal that was recently signed, beginning in the 2020-2021 season, pays them $4 million per year. Again, behind the $7 million of the AAC. Now, next up is the Sun Belt. Now, the Sun Belt is probably the conference that's most on the rise in these non-Power 5 conferences. They, in July, announced that they had a new agreement with ESPN that goes through the 2030-2031 year. Now, what do schools receive per year in this contract is, I found a few different sources that kind of pegged it at around $2 million a year potential. And Shane Medlin's reporting in the Daily News Record does cite that $2 million number. So that's a place you can go look and read more about it. He seemed to have the most information. Now, of course, the Sun Belt has, with this new contract, been able to attract several CUSA programs, including Marshall, which is probably the biggest get. So the Marshall, of course, is going to be heading to the Sun Belt, and that $2 million a year deal is a big part of that. Again, if you recall, the Conference USA was more like 500,000 annually. So that's a quick rundown of the non-Power 5 TV contracts. Of course, the previous episode we did the Power 5, and the numbers are much different. It gives you a big understanding. When you've got the Big Ten, which is approaching, the Big Ten, which in their current contract, each school's getting over $31 million base, not including playoff, not including other things. That's their current deal. They're about to re-sign a new deal. SEC, a similar thing, $30 to $50 million in base. They're getting extra money for their CBS primetime game, playoff appearances, and bowl games, etc. So it's by a factor of 10 a lot of times compared to these non-Power 5 schools, compared to the Power 5 school TV deals. Makes sense. It's the product that many people want to see. But in the Sun Belt's case, there's an example where they've found their niche of saying, hey, we can provide weekly content, content during the week, and maybe that's worth something, right? People love to watch Sun Belt. They love to watch the American Athletic Conference. Honestly, they love to get as much college football as they can. But it's interesting that you see, in terms of facilities, recruiting ability, that kind of stuff, the top of the Power 5 is 10x, and sometimes even more, like 100x. When you're talking about Conference USA and the Mid-American, we're talking 100x, more than 100x that these top schools are getting in these top conferences compared to those conferences. So it's a big difference. And that just sort of hopefully illuminates a little bit on those numbers. Thank you so much for listening. Talk to you next time.